The rain poured relentlessly against the city skyline, each drop hitting the pavement like a drumbeat of fate. She stood in front of the massive glass tower, her heart steady, her mind sharper than ever. It had been years since she last stepped foot in this building, years since she walked away with nothing but the clothes on her back and the sting of betrayal burning in her chest. Back then, she had been the wife of a powerful CEO, a man who once promised her forever, but discarded her like a forgotten investment the moment she was no longer convenient. She remembered the way he looked at her that day, cold and indifferent, as if the years they spent together meant nothing. "You were never cut out for this world," he had said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Go back to where you came from." And she did, but not in the way he expected. The woman who left was broken, humiliated, and penniless. The woman standing here today, she was a force to be reckoned with. The past had forged her into something stronger, something unstoppable. She had built her own empire from the ground up, turning her pain into power, her loss into leverage. And now, she was back, not for revenge, but for justice. Inside that building sat the man who had once controlled every aspect of her life, a man who had underestimated her. He thought she would disappear, that she would accept defeat. But he had no idea who he had let go. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked through the doors. The battle was just beginning. The moment she stepped into the lobby, the air shifted. The space was just as she remembered, cold, pristine, and designed to intimidate. Towering glass windows stretched from floor to ceiling, showcasing the city below, as if to remind anyone who entered just how small they were in comparison to the empire built within these walls. She had been one of those people once, young, hopeful, trusting. She had walked these very floors thinking she belonged, believing that love and loyalty were enough to secure her place. How foolish she had been. The receptionist barely spared her a glance at first, too busy tapping away at the sleek keyboard in front of her. But then, as if sensing something, she looked up, and the moment their eyes met, recognition flickered across her face. A pause, a slight widening of the eyes, the same reaction she had seen countless times over the past year. People had heard the stories. The woman who had vanished after a high-profile divorce, only to reappear as a business mogul in her own right. The woman who had been dismissed as nothing more than a footnote in someone else's success story, now making headlines of her own. But here, in this place, she knew exactly how they still saw her. No matter how far she had come, this building would always try to remind her of who she used to be. She refused to let it. "I'm here for a meeting," she said, her voice calm but firm. She didn't give her name. She didn't have to. The invitation had already been sent, whether he had expected her to accept it or not. The receptionist hesitated, then quickly recovered, nodding and gesturing toward the elevators. "Of course. He's expecting you." She doubted that. As she stepped inside the elevator, the doors slid shut with a quiet hum, enclosing her in a space that carried too many memories. The countless times she had stood in this very spot, watching the numbers rise, heart pounding for entirely different reasons. Back then, she had been in love. Back then, she had believed she was building a future with a man who saw her as his partner, not his possession. She had learned the hard way that some people only valued what they could control. The elevator stopped, and with a soft chime, the doors slid open. Stepping out, she was met with a familiar sight. The floor had been redesigned slightly, the decor updated to match the latest trends. But the energy remained the same. Power hummed in the air, thick with the weight of decisions that could change lives in an instant. And then she saw him. He stood by the window, his back to her, gazing out at the city below. The same city where he had once left her to struggle, thinking she would never rise again. She took a step forward, and as if sensing her presence, he turned. Their eyes met. For the first time in years, they were face to face, and neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, a battle of unspoken words, of history too heavy to be ignored. She could see it in his expression, the flicker of surprise, quickly masked by that familiar arrogance. He had always been good at hiding his emotions, but she had learned to read between the lines. "You actually came," he finally said, his voice as smooth and controlled as ever. She tilted her head slightly. "Would you have preferred if I didn't?" He let out a short breath, something between a laugh and a scoff. "I didn't think you'd want to step foot in this building again." "I go where I need to," she replied, her tone even. "And right now, this is where I need to be." He studied her, his sharp gaze searching for something, but she gave nothing away. For years, she had waited for this moment, not to seek revenge, but to face him as an equal. To show him, and everyone else, that she was no longer the woman they had cast aside. But she wasn't here just for that. She was here for something bigger. Something that would shake the very foundation he had built his empire on. And he had no idea what was coming. He gestured toward the sleek leather chair across from his desk, but she didn't move. Instead, she let the silence linger, watching him shift ever so slightly. He was good at hiding discomfort, but not from her. She had once known him better than anyone, his strengths, his weaknesses, the way his confidence could crack under just the right kind of pressure. "I won't take up too much of your time," she said finally. "I know how busy you are." His lips curled into something that almost resembled a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "And yet, you came all this way. That tells me this isn't just a casual visit." She tilted her head, studying him the same way he studied her. Time had changed them both, but in different ways. He was still polished, still powerful, still the man who believed he was untouchable. But she had changed too. "You're right," she said. "This isn't casual. I'm here because I know what you've done." For just a fraction of a second, something flickered in his eyes, something cautious, guarded. Then it was gone, replaced by that same calculated ease he had always carried. He leaned back against his desk, arms crossed. "That's a bold accusation. Care to be more specific?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, I will. But first, I want to hear what you think I know." He exhaled, pushing himself off the desk and walking toward the window again. The way he moved, slow and deliberate, told her he was thinking. Measuring his words. Searching for control. "You've always had a way of making things dramatic," he said. "But let's not waste time. If you have something to say, say it." She stepped forward then, closing the distance between them. "You built this company on more than just smart business moves," she said quietly. "There are things hidden beneath the surface. Things you never wanted anyone to uncover." His jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "And you think you've uncovered something?" She reached into her bag, pulling out a folder. Nothing flashy, nothing loud, just a simple manila file. But when she placed it on the desk between them, the air in the room shifted. For the first time since she had walked in, he hesitated. She saw it, the slight twitch of his fingers, the way his gaze flickered toward the folder before locking back onto her. He wasn't used to being on this side of the conversation. "You can open it," she said, her voice calm. "Or you can pretend it doesn't exist. Either way, the truth doesn't change." He didn't move right away. Instead, he looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You think you can walk back in here after all these years and threaten me?" She shook her head. "This isn't a threat. It's a fact." He let out a slow breath, then finally reached for the folder. She watched as he flipped it open, his eyes scanning the pages inside. His expression remained steady at first, but then his jaw clenched just slightly. That was enough. She had him. "This is nonsense," he said, closing the folder with controlled precision. "If you're trying to start a fight, you're wasting your time." "I'm not trying to start anything," she said. "I'm finishing it." Silence. Heavy, loaded silence. She knew he was calculating his next move, just as she'd expected. He had always been ruthless when it came to protecting himself. But this time, he wasn't the only one playing the game. Finally, he exhaled, a slow, measured breath. "What do you want?" Her lips parted slightly, as if considering his words. Then she leaned in, just enough to make sure he felt the weight of them. "Justice." His gaze darkened. "And if I say no?" She straightened, adjusting the strap of her bag over her shoulder. "Then I suppose we'll see who the world believes when the truth comes out." She turned, walking toward the door. But just before she reached it, his voice cut through the tension. "You haven't changed as much as you think," he said. She paused, glancing over her shoulder. "And that's where you're wrong." With that, she walked out, leaving the door open behind her. But this was far from over. The city lights flickered outside as she stepped onto the sidewalk, her mind racing. The conversation had gone exactly as she expected, controlled, tense, with neither of them willing to show their full hand. But she had seen the crack in his confidence, the brief moment where he realized she wasn't bluffing. That was all she needed. She walked toward her car, keeping her pace steady, but the moment she slid into the driver's seat and shut the door, she exhaled deeply. It wasn't fear that gripped her, it was anticipation. Everything she had been working toward was falling into place, and now it was only a matter of time before the walls around him started to crumble. Her phone buzzed on the seat beside her. She glanced at the screen. A single message. "Be careful. He's already making moves." She tightened her grip on the steering wheel. She expected this. The man she had once trusted with her heart, the man who had thrown her aside without hesitation, wasn't the type to sit back and let someone challenge him. He would fight. And he would fight dirty. But so would she. She started the car, her mind already 3 steps ahead. She had a plan, and she wasn't alone. Back at her office, she pushed open the glass door, her assistant immediately standing from her desk. "You were right," her assistant said, her voice low but urgent. "He's already trying to bury it." She nodded, unsurprised. "What's his first move?" "He's pushing pressure on our investors. Whispers about instability, about risk." A pause. "And someone tried to access our internal files tonight. They didn't get in, but they're trying." Of course. He thought he could shut her down before she got too far. She shrugged off her coat and walked straight to her desk. "Let him try," she said. "He's fighting the wrong battle." Because this wasn't just about money. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about the truth, about exposing everything he had done, everything he had buried under years of power and control. And she was getting closer. She pulled out her laptop, fingers moving quickly as she brought up a set of documents, the real leverage she had been working on for months, the proof of everything. The connections, the deals done in the shadows, the names that would send shockwaves through the industry. Her assistant hovered nearby. "We need to move faster. If he starts pulling strings with the media, he'll control the narrative before we even have a chance." She nodded. "Then we move tonight." She grabbed her phone and dialed. The line rang once before a voice answered. "It's time," she said simply. "Drop the first piece." A pause. Then, understood. She hung up. By morning, the first crack in his empire would appear. But she wasn't done. Not yet. The next few hours passed in a blur. Phone calls, meetings, preparations. Every move she made had to be precise. She couldn't afford mistakes. She knew how he operated, how he would lash out the moment he realized he was losing control. And then, just before dawn, her phone buzzed again. A message. "He knows. He's coming for you." She stared at the words, her pulse steady. She had been waiting for this. Let him come. Because this time, she wasn't the one who would lose. The message still lingered on her screen, the weight of its meaning pressing against her. He knows. He's coming for you. She didn't flinch. She didn't panic. She had been preparing for this moment since the day she walked away from him. The city outside was still asleep, the streets quiet, except for the occasional car passing by. But she knew somewhere, in the shadows, his people were already moving. He wasn't the type to sit back and wait. He would strike first. That was his nature. She stood, grabbing her coat. "Call the team," she said to her assistant, her voice sharp, precise. "Tell them to be ready." Her assistant nodded, already dialing. She stepped out into the cool night air, her breath steady. The game was shifting, and she had to move faster than him. As she climbed into the back seat of a waiting car, her phone vibrated again. Another message. "You don't know everything." She stared at the words, her mind racing. This wasn't from her usual source. A moment later, a follow-up message came through. "Meet me. You're missing a piece of the puzzle." A location was attached. Her pulse quickened, but she didn't hesitate. "Change of plans," she told the driver. "Take me here." The car pulled into motion, and she sat back, eyes focused on the message. If this was a trap, she would be ready. But something in her gut told her this was different. Someone out there knew something she didn't. And that changed everything. The drive was silent, the city slipping past in a blur. When the car finally pulled up to the destination, a dimly lit parking garage, she scanned her surroundings. Empty. Still. But she knew better than to assume she was alone. She stepped out, her heels clicking against the concrete. "I'm here," she called out, her voice carrying through the space. A figure emerged from the shadows. She recognized him instantly. Not an ally, not an enemy, but someone she hadn't expected to see again. His expression was unreadable, but there was something urgent in his eyes. "You think you're in control of this," he said quietly. "But you don't understand what you've stepped into." She folded her arms, keeping her stance firm. "Then enlighten me." He hesitated. Then, after a long pause, he pulled a small flash drive from his pocket. "You've been looking in the wrong place," he said. "You thought he was your biggest problem, but he's just the beginning." She stared at the flash drive, her mind turning over his words. She had spent so much time preparing for him, her ex-husband, the man who had cast her aside and built his empire on deception. But if this was true, if there was something even bigger hiding beneath the surface, then she wasn't just fighting one man. She was up against something much, much larger. And she had no idea how deep it went. She stared at the flash drive in his hand, her heart pounding, but her face remained unreadable. This was it. The moment she had been building toward, the final piece of the puzzle. But the way he looked at her, the urgency in his eyes, made her hesitate. "You need to move fast," he said, his voice low. "Once you see what's on here, everything changes." She reached out, taking the drive. It was small, unassuming, but she could feel the weight of what it carried. Without another word, she turned and walked back to her car. The drive to her office felt longer than it was. Every second felt heavy, thick with anticipation. She had spent years preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, building her case, staying 3 steps ahead. But now, she wasn't sure what she was about to uncover. Inside, she locked the door, slid the flash drive into her laptop, and clicked the first file. A video. The screen flickered, and then she saw him. Her ex-husband. Sitting in a high-rise office, speaking to a man whose face was blurred. The audio was distorted, but she could still make out the words. "It has to be handled," her ex-husband was saying, his tone sharp, impatient. "She's getting too close." Her breath caught. The other man spoke, his voice low. "We'll take care of it." Like before. Like before. She pressed pause, her mind racing. This wasn't just about business fraud. This wasn't just about manipulation and control. This was something else entirely. She clicked through the rest of the file's documents, emails, bank transfers. And then, another video. She played it, and her blood ran cold. A meeting. Hidden footage. Her ex-husband, but not just him. Others. Powerful people. People she hadn't even considered. And they weren't just discussing business. They were discussing eliminating threats. She pulled back, her hands trembling. This was bigger than revenge. This was bigger than anything she had imagined. Her phone vibrated. Leave it alone. A second message followed. Walk away while you still can. She stood, grabbing her bag. There was no walking away. Not anymore. She had come too far. And now, she had everything she needed. She made the call. Drop it all, she said. Tonight. Her contact hesitated. Are you sure? She looked at the screen, at the damning evidence staring back at her. More than ever. She ended the call and took a deep breath. By morning, the world would know the truth. But as she turned off the laptop, she felt it a presence, just outside her door. She wasn't alone, and this wasn't over. Not yet. She stood frozen, her breath shallow, ears straining for any sound beyond the door. The weight of the moment pressed down on her. She had always known that exposing the truth would come with risks, but now, standing in the dim glow of her office, she realized just how close those risks had come. The handle of the door twitched ever so slightly. Someone was there, watching, waiting. She reached for her phone, fingers steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Just as she was about to call for help, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, slow, deliberate, then silence. She didn't move for what felt like forever. When she finally did, she approached the door cautiously, her pulse hammering. She swung it open in one quick motion, bracing herself. But the hallway was empty. Except for one thing. A single envelope lay on the ground just outside her door. Plain, unmarked, except for one word written on the front in bold black ink. Run. Her stomach twisted, but she didn't hesitate. She grabbed her bag, her laptop, and everything she could carry. She knew what this meant. They were out of time. As she stepped into the elevator, she sent one last message to her contact. It goes live now. No delays. The ride down felt endless, each floor bringing her closer to the unknown. When the doors finally slid open, she expected to see someone waiting, but the lobby was eerily quiet. She kept moving, forcing her steps to remain steady as she slipped out into the cool night. She didn't go home. That wasn't safe anymore. Instead, she drove, her mind replaying everything. The files, the videos, the voices on the recordings. She had everything, and soon so would the world. Her phone vibrated, and she saw the notification. The first news report had just gone live. The floodgates had opened. She pulled off the road into an empty parking lot and watched as the world reacted in real time. Headlines flashed across her screen. Social media exploded with discussions, questions, outrage. She scrolled through the names being exposed, her ex-husband's among them. A part of her had expected relief. A part of her had thought this moment would bring a sense of victory. But as she sat there, staring at the screen, she realized something else. This wasn't an ending. This was just the beginning. Her phone rang. A familiar voice on the other end. It's done, they said. But there's something you need to know. She listened, her grip tightening around the wheel. There was another name. One she hadn't uncovered. One that had stayed hidden beneath the layers of deception. Someone even more powerful. And now, they knew her name too. She closed her eyes for just a second before straightening in her seat. The fight wasn't over. But she wasn't afraid. Not anymore.